call right now. But I will come back to the agenda. Again, my name is Andre Marco. I'm the director of ERCST. The topic of the day is border carbon adjustment in the EU, the launch event for the launch of our paper on a solution for export of EU CBAM-covered goods. The agenda, as you see it here, is a welcome and presentation of the paper by the authors, which includes, besides myself, Michael Melling, Aaron Cosby, and Laura Fleury, who has done most of the work in putting this together. We have panel interventions from Vicente Hurtado Roa from DG Taxud, who presumably will join us at some point, Michael Grappolo, University College of London, Yves Melin from Cassidy Levy Kent, Paweł Rosicki from the Ministry of Climate and Environment in Poland, Sandra de Plas for Carbon Market Watch, and Robert Janieko from ArcelorMittal. We also had invited Astrid, which is a colleague of Vicente Hurtado Roa, and Tatiana San Miguel from ArcelorMittal. They couldn't join us today, and we regret that, but it is people put their own priorities on meetings, and we understand that and respect that. So the agenda for the day, as I mentioned, is first the presentation, then we have the panel intervention, a roundtable discussion, and then upcoming CBAM events and activities. So if you want to go to the first slide, to the next slide. Before we go to this next slide, all I also wanted to say is that ERCST has been working on the topic of CBAM for 6 years. And during this 6 years, we have covered many topics. Some of them initially more theoretical because there was no CBAM. Some of them have become more practical as the CBAM evolved and as we learned to address now issues with issues. One of those issues which continues to preoccupy many people in the application of CBAM is that the lack of provisions for export, and that is an issue that is important to many, and we'll see why. We also know that there is right now, there's been in the omnibus bill simplification from the CBAM, and clearly this is not a simplification, so that was not included in the omnibus bill. But the way we understand it, and again, we don't speak for the European Commission or DG Taxud, we understand that sometime in the middle of the year, probably July, as we go prepare for vacation, summer vacation, there will be a review of the CBAM. It's going to be a little bit anticipated, but there will be a review of CBAM. And that review of CBAM will include many topics. This may be one of them. And again, I don't want to kind of put words in anybody's mouth, but we do hope this will be something that will be touched upon. So let's move on then with the paper presentation. Laura, you start, and then we move it to Aaron and Michael.
Yeah, thank you, Andre. You actually gave a bit of an introduction to this slide, so it's quite good. So first, to remind all of us why exports matter in CBAM. So we know that CBAM addresses carbon leakage within the EU, but currently is lacking any treatment of exports, which pose, of course, a risk to a segment of the EU industry. So without this export support, the EU industries that are covered by CBAM lose ground to competitors in countries that have more lax climate rules, which creates both economic losses and higher global emissions due to the shift in their production to dirtier regions. As we all know, this is called the export-related carbon leakage. And as you said, Andre, so there's kind of this pressure that's intensifying in 2025, as it's a very pivotal year to all the reviews that are going to happen to really finalize the design of CBAM. There are going to be also some EU decisions under the Omnibus framework that will be finalized in 2026. So all of this is really happening in parallel as well to rising input costs, global overcapacity, and trade barriers. For example, US tariffs at the moment that are quite significant. So all of this really is challenging EU exporters. And then this competitive global market really limits those EU producers to pass the carbon costs onto the buyers. So this loss in competitiveness in the global markets will erode the market share in the EU and will also, of course, have environmental consequences. Now, why is the status quo not possible, or at least what's wrong about it? The exports are critical to the CBAM-covered industries. So here we put some key figures from previous research. So iron and steel has 22% of its EU production dedicated to exports. For aluminium, it's 18%. For fertilizers, it's 14%. And for the cement industry, it's 7.7%. So really high percentages. And also for some countries in the EU, that represents a really high part of their production. Now, a few years back, the European Commission produced a review and shared the 6.8% figure representing the loss in export market share due to the absence of export provision. Of course, this will lead to higher global emissions and EU industries generally have lower carbon intensities compared to other jurisdictions. So all of this really threatens the key industries, especially also the ones that have rising energy costs like fertilizers and petroleum refining. And these also have capacity constraints. So it puts those plants at risk of closure, the risk of job losses, and economic decline, together with, of course, higher global emissions. So just to give you kind of a wrap up of why we are still talking about this issue today. And I'll hand over to Aaron.
Just one word here that I want to add is the percentage that you see are EU-wide percentages, but there are quirks in this. The fertilizer has seasonal production and usage, and as such, it's much magnified. In the case of cement, as you mentioned, some of them are, the overall average is 7.7%. It's quite down from 17.5%, but for Greece, for instance, is close to 60%. So the EU averages hide some very significant variations, which are very much regional and in some cases seasonal. Sorry, Aaron, please go ahead.
Thanks. So what do we do about the fact that the status quo is undesirable? Michael is going to come after me and is going to summarize some of the most interesting proposals for coverage of exports within the CBAM. But before that, the report that we've authored goes into some of the alternative methods that have been proposed and are currently in use in various places to try to reduce the costs of carbon to CBAM-covered industries, both within the EU and internationally, and as a result, reduce the risk of leakage. Are those sufficient? Do we need to even think about the prospect of export coverage within CBAM? Because, as Michael's going to discuss, that proposition is legally contentious and complex. So can we rely on these existing measures? Our survey of those measures boils down to three types of measures to reduce the carbon costs that are incurred by industries under a full carbon price of the type we're proposing under the ETS with lack of free allocation. First, to lower the cost of the decarbonizing investment that we hope firms will make in response to the carbon price. And here we can think of grants, loans, tax incentives that would help to cover the costs, the heavy, high upfront costs of investment in decarbonizing capital that these kinds of firms can undertake. Second, policies that will ensure the supply of needed inputs in a decarbonized production pathway. So if we think about the decarbonizing pathways for steel and fertilizers, they're going to involve a great deal, probably going to involve a great deal of green hydrogen as feedstocks. All of our covered sectors are going to need a great deal of low carbon electricity. Without those inputs at adequate supply and adequately low cost, to be clear, we do not get the benefits of decarbonized production within the EU. You can build a steel plant that's ready for direct reduced iron production, that's ready for green hydrogen as an input, but if the green hydrogen is not there, you're not going to get a low carbon production of steel. Somebody's mic is on. Maybe should mute.
I think somebody is very overly enthusiastic, and I'm not sure how to do this, but I'm sure there's a way to do it. Do you know how to?
If I'm looking at my screen, it was okay. We're good.
Okay.
So this is the second type of
I have to find out how you disconnect everybody.
This is the second type of support you can imagine that would reduce the risk of leakage by reducing the costs of carbon incurred by covered firms. The third kind is the creation of lead markets. And here primarily we think about government procurement promises to offtake agreements, basically, to purchase the green products of decarbonized EU industry. And this is a way to make up for the fact that even after you've covered the cost of investment, your operating costs may be higher under a decarbonized scenario than under a conventionally produced scenario. So what are the challenges and the limitations to these three types of policy options? Quickly, first, they have an uneven impact across firms and sectors. So whereas the leakage risk is uniformly felt by firms across the various sectors, these kinds of policy initiatives are only going to benefit selected firms, those that have clear decarbonization pathways, those that apply for and are granted the kinds of policy support that's on offer. Even if we're talking about measures like with broad-based impacts, like reduced electricity costs, the effects will be uneven and will be felt more strongly by those firms that use greater amounts of electricity, like aluminum. So uneven impacts across firms and sectors. Some firms will not benefit from these types of support. Second, we know that the fixed cost of carbon are going to increase as free allocation is reduced. We are not equally certain that these kinds of policies will be successful. If we're talking about lowering the cost of electricity across the EU, for example, the kinds of market reform that are necessary to effect that are difficult, politically controversial, and will take many years. So we're not sure about the success of many of the types of policies we're talking about here. We are very certain about the types of costs that will be incurred. So there's a disconnect there. Thirdly, the kinds of fiscal resources needed to cover the increased costs of low carbon production are probably going to strain the available fiscal resources of the European Union. We're talking about, for a single steel plant retrofit from blast furnace to EAF, in the neighborhood of €500 million. So, I mean, and multiply that by the number of steel firms, by the number of sectors we're talking about a great deal of investment as well as higher operating costs. And finally, there's a mismatch with timing. The carbon leakage risks will begin in 2026 or 2026 when liabilities become due, even though it's a slowly ramped up pace. Success at the kinds of reforms and policies we're talking about will happen over many years. The retrofit of a single steel plant will, from conception to completion, take 7 years. Who knows how long carbon market reform will take? So there is a mismatch between the immediately felt carbon leakage risk and vulnerability and the longer term prospects of success from the kinds of supporting policies we're talking about. To sum up, these policies, we're not denigrating them as necessary for the assuring competitiveness of CBAM-covered firms. They are necessary and valuable, but they are not sufficient to cover the kind of broad-based risk that comes from a lack of export coverage under the CBAM in the face of a full carbon price. So I pass it along to Michael to talk about what we do about that.
Thank you, Aaron. I feel a bit left out. Aaron's in one airport, Andre in another airport, and I'm just at home. So to continue where Aaron left off, we, of course, are focusing on more direct solutions, targeted solutions on export-related leakage. But I will revisit a lot of the things that Aaron said, because some of the proposals out there are sort of more indirect as well, and we do compare them, as you'll see in one of the next slides. But first, as we're looking at targeted solutions and also to export-related leakage, and also trying to sort of devise a way of evaluating, assessing, and comparing them, we came up with a number of criteria that we feel that any successful solution has to meet. This, again, also builds on some of the weaknesses or shortcomings, at least in the short term, of what Aaron just described for broader, more long-term sort of alternative approaches to dealing with the problem. First, of course, it has to deal with export-related leakage. So it has to be successful in mitigating that. And that means it has to also prevent market share loss of European producers, which, as Laura mentioned initially, tend to, on average, be cleaner, so less carbon intensive than their foreign competitors in global markets. So that's the first sort of criterion. The second one, and this brings back a lot of criticism from stakeholders, especially environmental advocacy groups and other think tanks that have been looking at export-related leakage and have been somewhat hesitant that the debate might incur, some solution that would just stabilize current carbon intensities in perpetuity and protect incumbent producers using outdated carbon-intensive production processes without sending a signal for decarbonization, is that any solution should nonetheless also, while preventing market share loss, create and maintain incentives for industrial decarbonization. So from an environmental perspective, that's another important criterion. Third, the debate has been dominated by discussions around the WTO, World Trade Organization, compatibility of any solution. And as I'll also come back to in a forthcoming slide, further down in this presentation, this has really been perhaps the argument that has stifled sort of constructive debate on export-related leakage solutions in the past. So it also has to tick that box. And fourth, as any solution, it should not incur such administrative complexity that it becomes impossible to effectively implement, oversee, and so on, especially now in a context where we have a ongoing debate on simplification and reducing administrative burdens, both for government agencies as well as, of course, for domestic and foreign producers. These were our four sort of criteria, our four conditions for a successful export-related leakage solution. Now, if one looks at the actual proposals that have been made in the last 4 years, roughly, since the CBAM legislative proposal was released in July 2021, one can kind of categorize them or group them in 3 different categories. The first are really the most immediate and most targeted solutions. These are any kind of mechanism that provides some sort of exemption, a rebate, or financial compensation to producers that are exporting goods, and does so within the context of the CBAM or EU ETS regime, for instance, with continued free allocation. Most of the proposals, and anything that's called like an export rebate, as many of these proposals label themselves, fall in that first category. The second one would be what Aaron already just mentioned, mechanisms that seek to sort of strengthen. Andre, that wasn't you, I hope.
No, I was just clearing my. No, I'm just clearing my throat. Apologies.
We've all been on Connie Hedegaard's OECD roundtable where that's the warning sign, you're going too long. So, so entirely separate support mechanisms. Aaron already discussed these, and there have been proposals, and I'll briefly mention them so we can also compare them along the 4 criteria or 4 conditions that I just described. And finally, there have been some interesting, very alternative proposals that do operate through pricing, not subsidies, not sort of flanking support, really direct pricing mechanisms, but that are not CBAM or EU ETS related, that introduce a totally new mechanism. And I'll briefly look at these. Let's go to the next slide. And here we have a table comparing sort of a number of the most influential proposals. There have been proposals from member states, from a number of trade associations, also think tanks and academics, and even law firms that have looked sort of at the legality. And I can't, of course, go into detail of all of them, but you see that most of these tend to fall in the first category, export rebates or compensation mechanisms. These are generally characterized by promising to be very effective solutions to the market share loss and export-related leakage problem, because they really deal with the carbon cost facing producers that are producing for export markets, or whose, where a share of production goes to export markets. But these same proposals do tend to have trade-offs. Some of them offer a less clear incentive to decarbonize, although most designs of such export rebates or compensation mechanisms do try and incorporate a way to incentivize decarbonization. And I'll highlight that in the next slide, so not yet. But what they do share is raising concerns on the WTO compatibility of these solutions, because, and there's been a lot of legal literature, we have contributed to that, but also a number of academics and law firms, a lot of legal literature looking at especially the agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures under the WTO, so one of the WTO covered agreements, and where it's pretty clear that any design that sort of provides, whether it's free allocation or even financial compensation to exporters, risks being classified as a prohibited subsidy. And there have been a number of arguments. There's a footnote in the ASCM that would exempt, that would prevent that classification as a prohibited subsidy if it's a rebate for an indirect tax. But then you enter the discussion, is the EU ETS and the CBAM, are these indirect taxes? And the Court of Justice itself has said it's not a tax, it's a regulatory mechanism. So there's no way that one can sort of clearly say, no, this is absolutely free of risk, despite some legal assessments that suggest, that still it should be not as risky as many say. And we generally fall into the category ourselves in our assessment that it does increase the legal risk, but the CBAM itself is definitely not free of legal risk. There's no precedent, there's no case law that really directly tells us that the CBAM itself, even without an export rebate, will just pass muster, and that any sort of export rebate may increase the risk modestly. So the question is, what are the priorities and what is the broader global context? Administrative feasibility of these targeted export rebates tends to be relatively manageable because they simply piggyback on existing mechanisms like free allocation, for instance. One doesn't have to develop an entirely new set of tools. Now, given the one sort of weak area, you could say, or Achilles heel of these export rebates on export rebate proposals, the sort of collective question about their WTO admissibility, there have been alternative suggestions. And some fall in the category of more what Aaron was describing, flanking support, but maybe targeted more to exporters or industries, sectors that have a high share of exports in order to accelerate their decarbonization. And these probably, although again there, the link to making it, to interpreting it as a prohibited subsidy is not entirely risk-free, I think, but nonetheless, they do promise to be somewhat less risky from a trade law perspective, and they can provide strong incentives to decarbonize. But of course, and as Aaron was saying before, these things don't immediately reduce the pressures on exporters by sort of offsetting part of the carbon cost. These typically, because they help investment in future production facilities or help decarbonize existing ones, but over an investment cycle will not immediately be effective. And so on the first criterion, they do sort of compare less favorably to the export rebates. And then there have been some interesting proposals that are complete alternatives, like, for instance, a consumption charge piggybacked on top of the EU ETS with continued free allocation, which would deal with the WTO risks, because this really would be then a tax or a fiscal measure that can be rebated at the border under that footnote to the Agreement on Subsidies and Countervailing Measures. No question that from a legal perspective, these would be less risky. But for instance, the administrative implementation of an entirely new regime on carbon price is one thing that we think just probably won't allow it to proceed to progress in the current political environment, and given, you know, the many other priorities that we currently face politically, including trying to reduce rather than add to sort of the administrative and regulatory burdens in the European economy. So this sort of as a high-level overview. The next slide shows what we kind of inferred from all this and from this comparison, and it's essentially what we already had outlined in 2022 in our first report on dealing with the export leakage problem. And it is to introduce an export rebate, but where we have a few tweaks that we think deal with or reduce some of the risks under WTO law, and that make sure to also retain the environmental incentives. And many of the proposals actually contain some of these elements. We just have assembled them in the way that we think is the most favorable. And this would essentially be a system of non-fungible or non-tradable export adjustment certificates. So exporters, once they document the share of production that they've exported, would be issued export adjustment certificates. These would not be tradable. These would not have intrinsic financial value that could be like, if it were free allocation of allowances under the EU ETS, could immediately be sold on the market for financial, you know, for financial return. So we hope that this reduces the chances that it would be considered a financial subsidy. But when compliance periods come up under the EU ETS, they could be converted into EUAs, again, without allowing trade. They could be converted for immediate compliance, and thus reducing the compliance costs, the carbon costs facing producers that export into global markets. Importantly, the award would be based on the existing system of benchmarks under the EU ETS, which, as you know, provides only a partial sort of free allocation because it's based on the 10% most carbon efficient producers. So all other producers will have a shortfall in a continued incentive to reduce their carbon intensity, or otherwise they still have a gap that they have to buy allowances to cover. And of course, the advantage of relying on this existing system of benchmarks is it reduces the administrative complexity because the system is already in place. Very importantly, finally, this shouldn't just be a perpetual system. There should be very transparent and clear periods when the need for this system and its functioning are reviewed, just like the CBAM, just like the EU ETS. And there should be a timeline for phasing out this system as these sectors continue to decarbonize. And if eventually, hopefully, the export-related leakage problem is no longer such a serious problem. And it should be accompanied by some of the flanking measures that Aaron already mentioned that take time to start kicking in. And again, reducing sort of the carbon cost, the symmetrical carbon cost faced by European producers vis-a-vis their competitors abroad. So we feel that this is a good sort of compromise in terms of offering immediate relief for European producers selling into global markets, while still reducing some of the risks or trade-offs that we highlighted and that we again saw sort of in our comparison of different solutions. And yes, and as Andre will then say at the end, we also feel that this moment politically, especially, I'm in the US, I'm outside of Washington, DC, as many other players do not at all care about WTO compatibility, and the whole existence and sort of relevance of the WTO regime going forward is somewhat in question. But certainly the EU is at a disadvantage vis-a-vis major trade partners that are not paying attention to WTO law. It begs the question whether the EU then should and has to take some courage and you know, show the political decisiveness to adopt a measure, even if there are slightly increased legal risks around that. Finally, in the next slide, so this is essentially on the WTO law questions. Again, there are heightened legal uncertainties, as I mentioned. This is a matter of European competence because it relates to international trade, and the legal services of the European Commission, as we understood it from conversations with various stakeholders, have categorically said it's not possible, it violates the ACM, or that the risks are too high. So this has stifled a debate. Member state officials have told us that there's just no debate because, you know, that's the end of the debate when the legal services say that. But again, in the global context, we feel that a lot of this may have to be reassessed. And the way that Europe and its adherence and its professed adherence to the international rules-based order would have, you know, probably required such adherence 10, 15 years ago may not be the right approach anymore in the current global context, given that many other actors have dramatically changed their attitudes to the WTO. And the EU being sort of the last lone sort of adherent may not be acting in its own self-interest, nor will it be able to save that regime on its own if major players are disregarding it. So that's sort of our survey of different proposals, our own proposal based on this survey, and our kind of appeal to think differently about the WTO compatibility issues. And again, what we think is just a moderately higher risk, but not a dramatically increased risk. We still feel that this can pass muster if it goes to some sort of dispute settlement. With this, back to Andre.
Yeah, I was coughing gently. Look, the conclusion that we'll take away, and I think we'll like to hear reactions. I think Vincent is just chaffing at the bit, waiting to go. But the first conclusion that one would have is that if exports were deemed to be important and when the initial discussion took place, I think that that concern is increasing. I think we've seen clear examples of the importance and the increasing importance of export, and especially in a situation of increasing concerns about competitiveness of European industry. As Michael closed, is the WTO is something that we all respect. The EU is one of the pillars of the multilateral world order. It is quite clear that the global agenda has shifted. We see a lot of discussion about trade and trade barriers and trade tariffs and trade this and trade that. We see the WTO less present. It's not that we're throwing stones at it. It's just a conclusion we have that, as Michael said, the major partners seem to care less about this. And is this EU le dernier carré, or is this something that in the end, the risk that comes with this, with including export, is something that in the end we need to consider. That risk of WTO violation exists. The CBAM itself has never been tested. The fact that you introduce an export provision, the only effect is that it increases that level of risk, but the risk, to be quite blunt, is not zero right now. Now, there are alternative solutions that Aaron has talked about. Those alternative solutions are very valid, are necessary, but not sufficient conditions. They are there are a number of problems with that, but to us, one of the important things is that yes, it is a cure and it provides medicine for the problem, but it may be by the time the medicine takes effect that the patient may be dead. So it is possible that we can. Is it a desirable outcome that we wait until these things come into effect, until they come and actually begin to be impacted, to feel the impact of these measures, while we are in a situation where in a very critical decade where European industry is already in trouble, and do we want to add to that trouble? And finally, the last part of it is that in the end, yes, there's a risk. Yes, in the end, there are many ways of looking at this. ERCST is not a rule-making body. ERCST is not a policy body. So we have a solution. We offer a solution. It may be for a variety of reasons accepted, not accepted, and we understand that. But the one thing that I would say is that no outcome or no solution for export is simply not an acceptable outcome. At least in our mind, it's difficult to say this is okay, guys. Let's not have a solution for this. We'll just go ahead as it is, because you have to balance the probability, the risk of running in a WTO problem versus the outcome, the cost of that risk, versus compare that with the risk of not having an export solution and the consequences for European industry. So you're basically playing the risk of kind of possibly antagonizing WTO with the risk of damaging in a maybe reversible way in some cases European industry. And I think that's a risk that politicians are getting paid to make that assessment. And we would argue that it's false clearly that the risk of the European industry will have to trump the other risks. So we will stop here. I hope that you found some interesting ideas in this. We'll now go to our panel. We'll go in the order we have here with Vicente, Michael, Yves, Pavel, Sam, and Robert. But we'll start first with Vicente.
Thank you, Andre. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks a lot for being invited to this. It's always a pleasure being here surrounded by so bright people with ideas and showing how to be creative. And it can only be, of course, an encouragement for us and a motivation for us to continue working and trying to find solutions to all problems. I think that the point you bring today to the debate is, of course, a very important point. It has been raised from the beginning, I would say, by the industry in particular. And now I think it's very timely, of course, also this discussion, because as you possibly saw in the communication of last week on the Steel and Metals Action Plan, the Commission has already announced that we want to come with a communication before the summer in Q2, whatever Q2 means, in any case before the summer, on exports. As you also saw possibly in this action plan, because the other issues which have been raised very often and very important of course, for an effective implementation of CBAM are the questions of the resource shuffling and the downstream goods. So I can also announce that, as said in the action plan, that there will be a proposal by the Commission by the end of the year covering these issues. But today we came to discuss about exports. I really appreciate your paper, and that comes or drags from your ideas that you presented some months ago or even some years ago, and in particular these non-tradable export adjustment certificates. So we are looking at this with a lot of interest. And of course, as you know, the question of the exports was also raised in the Draghi's report on competitiveness. So this is one of the issues that has been very close also to the heart of our Commissioner Hoekstra, who already during the hearing in front of the Parliament said that we would be advancing the analysis of the impact of CBAM on exports even before 2027. As you know, in the CBAM regulation, there is an obligation to do that on a regular basis from 2027. But he already reassured the members of the Parliament and everyone that, of course, that's something that is important and we would advance. Now we know that there is this confirmation of a communication, and I can tell you that the Commission is working on that in order to come with ideas and solutions for this issue. But of course, all will start first with an analysis of the issue. It's not so easy, I have to say, because it not only concerns the CBAM goods or producers of the CBAM goods, but also some of the downstream goods. For example, let's take the case of those who are exporting in the EU downstream goods intensive in aluminum or in steel, and which may be subject to carbon leakage. So the first thing is to analyze, of course, the boundaries and the parameters of the problem, and also to analyze how important this issue will be, in particular in the first years when, as you know, the level of free allowances will be still high. But of course, as we move to 2034, of course, the issue will become more and more relevant. We always said that in this transitional period, we wanted to learn and we wanted to fine-tune the system. So this is why, in particular, we are looking at the three issues that I mentioned before. The focus, of course, now, as you know, with the Clean Industrial Deal is on the industrialization of Europe, on how to support the EU industry. And then, of course, this has been more or less delineated or more precise for the different sectors, starting, for example, with the steel and metals, but this will also go on and continue with the chemicals and other sectors. The president has launched the dialogues with the industry, with the EU industry of those sectors, how to improve their competitiveness and how to make sure that, of course, we are able to support them. And then CBAM comes to the picture, of course, as you know, and I will not repeat again and again, and has been said today, CBAM has an environmental objective, but one, of course, of the objectives is to avoid the risk of carbon leakage. And why is carbon leakage important, and in particular in the context of the exports or sales in third countries? Because indeed, what we want to make sure is that with the CBAM, we are contributing to the decarbonization in the EU, but also globally. And that's not only an issue with the imports of goods into the EU, but of course, this can be also an issue with the production and the sales of goods everywhere. So we are really attentive to this situation. We are analyzing the risk of carbon leakage when it comes to exports. You probably saw the Carbon Markets 2024 report last December. It's under the responsibility of our colleagues in the ETS, in DG Clima, which has a section on this particular issue, on the risk of carbon leakage for exports. They identify, according to two parameters, the carbon intensity of the production of those goods, and also the tradability or the exposure to exports of those goods. They analyze, or they make a first filter or analysis of the main goods which would be or could be subject in the ETS at the risk of carbon leakage. But as I said before, the risk of carbon leakage can even go down the supply chain, can even go down to the downstream goods. So that's something that, of course, we need to look at also carefully. The question is that, of course, the analysis will need to look at the question or at the issue from different angles, but also taking into account some of the parameters. I think Michael was very clear on the requirements or on the parameters. We can discuss more or less about WTO compatibility. We still believe in that. So we still think that any measure, of course, has to comply with WTO, but also with all the other requirements or other international engagements. And at the same time, of course, the measure has to be conducive or has to contribute to the objectives of avoiding carbon leakage, reducing global carbon emissions in the EU, but also in third countries. At the same time, of course, the measure has to be effective in achieving the objectives and has to be balanced with respect, of course, also to the administrative burden. You know that we adopted a package of simplifications already in last February. It's been under discussions now in the Council, but also in the Parliament. We hope that there will be an adoption or at least an agreement between Council and Parliament before the summer. But again, I mean, as you can see, there is a lot of interest also in what we do that has to be, of course, as low as burdensome as possible and bring the least of the administrative burdens that we can. Of course, we always have to find a balance. Any measure you introduce will have some sort of administrative burden, but of course, if there are 2-3 different ways of doing the same to achieve the same objective, we will have to look at the most simple. And then it has to be targeted, okay? It's not just per se to say that CBAM should, or a measure export or some sort of contribution to exports should apply to all producers of CBAM goods in any conditions. So that's something that, of course, should be targeted to the specific case, to the specific goods, which are at the risk of carbon leakage, taking into account, of course, the importance of exports for those companies, and also at the same time, of course, taking into account the achievement of the objectives with the carbon emission reduction. And finally, of course, the measure has to be coherent with all the other measures in the CBAM, and in particular with the measures that apply to imports. So I think it's also important that by introducing some sort of measure on exports, we also have to look at what will be the impact in terms of importers, and also the impact in terms of producers in third countries exporting to the EU. So the coherence is very important, and also at the same time it has to be coherent, of course, with the architecture and the governance of the ETS. As you possibly know, there will be another review next year. So I think this comes, of course, timely. But in any case, any measure under the CBAM does not have to undermine, of course, the application, the governance, and the architecture of the ETS. I think Aaron said something very interesting as well. Of course, we need also flanking measures. We can think in the context of the CBAM, but I think that the measures that have been presented and that they are listed also at the beginning of the report that you are now putting on the table also for this webinar, I think that they are very, very important. In the end, we are always talking about the same. It's the impact of the cost of the reduction of the CO2 emissions. It's about introduction of clean techs. Of course, it's about the carbonization of electricity, increasing the dependency on electricity, on green hydrogen. And that, of course, as we will be doing that, of course, that will be also contributing first to the objective of decarbonization, secondly, more important, to decarbonizing the EU industry, and thirdly, of course, that will reduce the risk of carbon leakage. But we are aware of the fact that nothing or all cannot be achieved in 1 year or in 2 years. And as the free allowances will be being phased out, we need also to find also other ways how to make sure that we deal with the risk of carbon leakage. So I can confirm that we are working now at high speed on this communication on exports. I don't want to be a spoiler, so I'm not going to anticipate what you will be reading in May. But of course, the discussion today, everything we are reading, I mean, there was a nice table presented also by Michael with all the ideas on exports and how to deal with the risk of carbon leakage with exports. I mean, that's something, of course, that we are analyzing carefully. But again, as I said before, we need to look at all the different angles, and we need to make sure that we are able to find a balance in terms of course, of policy. So I just would like to finish by saying that the Clean Industrial Deal has set the tone. The Clean Industrial Deal is very clear on the path that we want to follow. We want to support industry. That's, I think, something which is important. And I think that the industry is understanding that there is a big interest of the Commission of doing this. At the same time, we want, of course, to continue supporting decarbonization. And we think that there is a way to do the two things at the same time. One is not in contradiction with the other. I think that's the important message. And also CBAM can adapt. CBAM can be revitalized or reviewed. Use the words that you prefer, improved, in order to, of course, achieve the objectives. I would just mention that what I said at the beginning, that we are also working on a proposal by the end of the year that will take a bit more of time, and that will be, of course, covering the two important aspects of how to also cover some downstream goods within the scope of CBAM, particularly those which are at risk of carbon leakage, again, and also the question of resource shuffling, which I know it's very important for some industries in the EU, and which are important, of course, in order to avoid or to make sure that CBAM will be effective from 2026. Well, thank you very much. I will not be able to stay with you the whole afternoon. Sorry for that, but I will try to listen to the rest of the panelists and maybe to catch some of the first reactions. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Vicente. I'm taking over from Andre, who's hopefully boarding his plane right now. Thanks for the update on, the roadmap at the Commission's end and the context. And we're, of course, encouraged that our criteria seem to match sort of what you're looking at in terms of the goals and objectives of finding a solution for export-related leakage with targeted, not just flanking solutions. I'll go over to the panelists, to the further panelists, and I'm very happy to invite Michael Grubb to offer his thoughts and reactions I think Michael probably doesn't need an introduction in any group that's familiar or works on climate policy, a veteran, of course, of European and international climate debates. He's a professor of energy and climate change at University College London. Without further ado, over to you, Michael, and thanks for joining us.
All right, thank you very much. I was going to sort of start by thanking, I think, Andre for inviting me on this panel, with the hesitation being that I almost turned it down because I used to work a lot on carbon pricing, ETS design, etc. And indeed, in days when I was chief economist at the Carbon Trust, taught me just how politically important these concerns around competitiveness are to any real world issue. And yet I moved in a range of different directions, haven't really been involved in the latest evolution of EU ETS or CBAM. Although, of course, I've kind of tried to follow it with interest, but so I'm not sure if that background makes me an expert or merely out of date. It's a bit of both, perhaps. So what I'll try and do is step back with a few observations, having watched the evolution of some of these issues over a period and widely. Maybe worth saying that those early studies I'm involved in did lead me to one conclusion, which is on some of the thornier issues, one has to take, if at all possible, a sector-specific approach. And I wonder if that may also be true with respect to exports, because the characteristics of sectors can be so different. But I'll start with what probably are very naive comments. I then want to make some reflections from a UK-EU standpoint, and then finish with brief remark on wider aspects. So on the first of those, what makes for a successful, an internationally successful and enduring regime? One element is consistency. And I've just been struck by the sense that a lot of the concerns raised about the effectiveness of its CBAM internationally is, won't other countries just do resource shuffling and they'll funnel their lowest carbon stuff to Europe and displace it with higher carbon stuff elsewhere? And that may or may not be true, it will vary by sector, but my reaction is, okay, so if we have an exports problem, to what extent does Europe, or can European industry address it by resource shuffling within Europe? I.e. all of the stuff which is drawing and which in theory should be in Europe's interest because it's got amongst the most low carbon economy of any of our major trading partners. You know, can any of these issues be addressed simply by having clearer contracting with low carbon ways of producing the stuff being exported? And I have no idea about the answer, the challenges, the issues. But since I hear resource shuffling every time you try and talk about the international impact and incentives, you know, I'd at least like to know the equivalent internally with respect to then exporting stuff. I think there may be a separate conversation there about the electricity inputs to traded goods, where obviously, you know, Europe now has a lot of zero carbon electricity. The problem is the market structure doesn't naturally lend itself to help. But if companies have, for example, PPAs or some other structures that enable very direct contracting with zero carbon electricity, does that help any of the electro-intensives like aluminium in terms of exports? So I think that question of electricity accounting, and I don't know the latest state of rules within CBAM, is something to think about. I should have perhaps meant to say also, I do think that it was a really interesting proposal. And my kind of gut feeling is it sounds like a very plausible compromise between various forces and risks that you've put forward, Michael and colleagues. Coming into a second area, I don't know how to phrase this. Please don't forget the UK. It does still exist just off the northwest coast of Europe. And it's a fairly major trading partner. There have been increasingly overt signals from the UK government about thinking, well, one of the major worries of our industry and others is around the terms of energy trade within which CBAM is a big issue and big concerns about treatment of electricity trade, potentially issues in gas trade as well, also with respect to hydrogen, biomethane, etc. Again, insofar as one's looking at exports from the EU to the UK, have a think about the symmetry and consistency of rules there, but also maybe think a bit more, well, not sure if positively, given some of the signals from the UK government, whether there is room in the May summit to actually talk about a more formal integration linking whatever mechanisms are used to sort of massage around the respective red lines. You all know they inherited red lines for the British government from Brexit. We all know the concerns about EU about cherry picking, but there's got to be some sensible deals and compromises in this area, in my view. If you thought of this as an expanded ETS, including the UK, what would that do to some of the numbers? For example, steel exports, how much is exported to the UK at present, etc. What would it do to the policy and political context of a sort of combined system? I've mentioned electricity and gas trade within it. So just a basket to think about there, which I haven't heard mentioned, but viewed from the UK, it's a pretty important dimension of it. I was going to suggest within that earlier aspect of also looking at sectorally specific, whether any sectors might be more amenable to the kind of proposals from Deutsches Institut Wirtschaft and others about, whether actually in some sector where you have particular problems, there's a case for combining a materials charge with an extension of free allocation. It's intellectually a really interesting proposal, but I get the point and concern about administrative complexity or inconsistency. Finally, I did want to take it back to a big picture level. I think one of the key challenges around the EU ETS is its political acceptability on the international stage. I think to some extent the EU has so far successfully said, well, we're going to do it. We'll go and make presentations at WTO. I've heard complaints from other countries. It's very nice you do presentations, but were you actually listening? How much is this viewed? And believe me, the export subsidy or export management will be a diplomatic issue. Michael, you referred to perhaps increasing some of the risks around challenges. My guess, I can't ask for a show of hands, I don't think we'd see it, but how many people on this call are from outside the EU or outside the OECD? My guess is it's very few, and yet the rest of the world will be watching this. The major emerging economies are going to be a major force around the next stage of climate change. China is now clearly directly committed to expanding its emissions trading system to energy intensive industries. It's obviously looking at its own 2030 cap on absolute emissions. I do hope there are discussions in this issue with some of the major emerging economies before one unilaterally again says, well, this is what we're doing. And oh dear, people are complaining. What a surprise. I mean, that is, I'm sorry, I'm being a little bit glib there, but this is a diplomatic issue in a highly charged geopolitical context. And I think European Union overall needs to be well aware of that, notwithstanding the domestic industrial interest and pressures. And my final comment on that is actually, Michael, you referred to EU trade partners increasingly willing to disregard WTO. Could you name which trade partners you're thinking about? I'm not as naive as that may sound. No, seriously.
Yeah, I did. Of course, I referenced where I'm located right now, which is just outside of DC, following with trepidation the latest announcements and the April threat of reciprocal tariffs. So that's one I know for sure. I don't want to extend to other countries.
So the reason I ask it that blunt way is I think we need to be clear. Are we talking about effectively US challenge to the WTO, which makes other countries rally round behind the institution? Or are we talking about many countries losing faith in the WTO and going their own way? those are fundamentally different geopolitical contexts. And I think that should also affect how the EU approaches this issue of export rebates diplomatically. Yeah, with that note, I'll finish.
Thank you, Michael. And thanks for adding that last point. I mean, I think in all the damage and sort of destruction that we're witnessing coming out of DC, intentionally or unintentionally, there may be that silver lining that it galvanizes, support and reminds countries of why we entered those multilateral orders in the first place. But we're not quite there yet, I think, but let's see. But anyway, thanks for those excellent points on a number of issues, role of UK, etc. In the interest of time, I'll move on to the next panelist, and I'll invite Yves Millin, who is a founding partner at Cassidy Levy Kent LLP in Brussels. And of course, we'd already heard that legal concerns, especially around the WTO admissibility, are one of the main issues that have been influencing this debate. So curious to hear your thoughts on that, and of course, anything else that's relevant.
Thanks a lot, Michael. So yes, I'm an international trade lawyer in CLK Europe. I'm more the customs type, so I have been looking at the CBAM more on how it's going to work at the border practically, etc. I have an army of WTO lawyers behind me, and so that's informed with that, and I'm going to give you my view on this. First is about limiting the risk before the WTO. I hear what you said, Michael, but you can never remove risk entirely in anywhere, and certainly not before the WTO. And so you need to make your, and when I say you, I'm looking at Vicente and the Commission behind him. The Commission has to look at the WTO, the ASCM here, Agreement on Subsidies and Countervailing Measures, and see where the CBAM fits. And I think there is a compelling case for considering the CBAM, actually the ETS with its CBAM add-on, and then with an export rebate add-on to the CBAM in its entirety as being an absolute necessity for the EU to achieve its climate objectives. It's been said by others. It's also very well laid out in your excellent report. ETS worked for sectors exposed to carbon leakage by providing free allowances to a series of industries. Essentially, since they were going to lose market share and then production to foreign competitors because of the absence of similar systems outside of the EU, they were given free allowances. The CBAM is there to replace the giving of free allowances by imposing an equivalent burden on CBAM goods that are coming into the EU. There's a number of percentage market shares that are given by sector in your report, which I found very interesting. I mean, if we don't enable the European industry to compete outside of the EU by imposing a burden that others don't have, we are going to take away, 20% of the market of the steel industry in Europe. Have you seen the state of the European steel industry, of aluminum industry, of fertilizers industry? They are on the brink. And so those industries, they need to be empowered to produce, not to just continue and survive. They need to be empowered to thrive. And this is essential for the EU to achieve its climate objectives, because if they don't thrive, it's going to be produced outside of the EU, very likely with Russian oil, and then it's going to come back into the EU. I mean, does that make any sense? If you incentivize production in Europe, you are going to incentivize the cleanest production that you can find, especially if the EU, and that's what the EU is doing, the EU is investing into renewables, it's investing in nuclear, so that the production in Europe becomes rapidly carbon-free. That will take half a generation to achieve, 10, 15 years' time. The removal of the free allowances starts next year. And it's completely removed in 2034. So the discussion of the export rebate is entirely linked to this time frame, even if it's noted in your paper. If you delay the phasing out of the free allowances, or if you backload it, it was very well put. You're not only partly addressing the issue. You need to provide a tool for EU industries, not just to survive, but to thrive by being able to export their products outside of the EU. How to justify, if you don't, they're going to disappear. or significantly reduce production, and then what have you achieved in your objectives? Climate objectives? Absolutely nothing. You've increased the emissions because your industries have shrunk. Then there is an additional consideration in all of this. The climate is hugely important in the CBAM and the ETS. Energy security is also essential in decarbonation of industrial processes in Europe. We don't have oil and gas, enough oil and gas. So it's the EU's national or economic interest to make sure that we have strong industries that are able to rely on abundant, cheap, carbon-free energy. And so that is something that has to play a role in the assessment of the EU. Then I'm old enough to have seen a number of things in WTO, and come to mind the time when in 2015, 2016, we had to decide whether China should be market economy status or not. And because the EU realized that it had an essential interest there not to recognize MES to China, it went back to its, I mean, you will find the best WTO lawyers on earth in the Commission. Right? There's a group there which is absolutely stellar. Maybe some of them are on the call. And you just discuss with them and you say, look, this is how this should be justified. They will prepare for you the best defense you can find under WTO. And then with this, you defend your position. You never know up front whether you're going to win or lose in the WTO. Like, you never know anything in litigation. You need to defend your position. Here, there are excellent arguments, very strong argument to justify the CBAM rebate under the WTO with shades of, color coding like you did very well in your table. I mean, I could have placed my colors differently, and that's also the nature of the exercise. You're talking to different lawyers with different views, and it's only going to be you only know whether you were wrong at the WTO if you've lost before the appellate body first, and then the issues that there is with the appellate body. Now we have the MPIA, so the EU's arms are tied behind its back a bit more than other countries like the US. And even then, if you lose, it's okay to lose in the WTO. You fix, right? You don't know on what is going to be wrong under the WTO in the CBAM, including its rebate aspect, if the appellate body in the MPIA and then ends up saying, yeah, look, I understand your objectives there, but that is a bit too much, and that is not necessary, and that's disproportionate. Then you fix. I mean, that's the normal way to use the WTO. It shouldn't be used as a reason to not act. And oftentimes it's very convenient. If you don't want to act, you just pull out a legal opinion, you say, can't be done. But I think we are past that now, and the export rebate is absolutely essential. It's essential because otherwise you just give up the export market share of European industries, and that's killing many of them. It's absolutely essential for the success of the ETS as a carbon removal tool, and for the energy transition of Europe, which is important for climate and security measures. It's absolutely essential for the EU's interest, and then defend that position. Of course, others will tell you that you can't do it. India will be upset about this. China said you can't do it, and that's normal. I mean, they want to sell our products in the EU, and without having to do too much investment in decarbonation, and just fight against it. So that's what I wanted to say on WTO. It's shades of gray, and then with good lawyers, you can defend a good position that is in the interest of the Union.
Merci bien, Yves. I think you put much more eloquently and compellingly kind of what we were trying to say as well. And I think in between the lines, aside from the practicalities, you also kind of highlighted that the WTO itself is evolving, and interpretations of certain doctrines are evolving. So where there is a will to act, one won't necessarily hold up that opinion just to block it because, one will instead defend it. Now, over to a member state perspective with Paweł Rosicki in Warsaw, I presume. He works at the Ministry of Climate and Environment, where he's held a number of leadership positions. And Paweł, we're curious to hear, how is this looking from the perspective of a member state in the EU?
Thank you very much, Michael. And first of all, thank you for the invitation and for the opportunity to be in such a good company and hear different point of views on different aspects of the problem. And of course, I think that the easiest way to help our industry is to lower the emission to zero, to use CCS, to use different zero emission technologies, renewable energies, and so on. And I believe that we will be there at some point of time in the future. But the problem is that we are now in the 2025, and the situation doesn't look so bright. And the problem exists. So I agree with your diagnosis that we need some tools to help European industry, not only with the carbon leakage caused by the import, but also some tools that will help them to at least equal the level playing field with the industry outside the Europe. Because we see in the statistics that you showed us on the slides that because of some reasons, combination of some reasons like high energy prices, cost of the climate policy, cheaper import, industry in all member states, I believe, have some problems, and it's also visible not only in the statistics. Because if you look at this problem from the local perspective, it's even bigger, because we are talking about losing workplaces and the collapse of sometimes of the whole local economies that is dependent on some specific industries, specific companies. We are seeing the problem in Poland even without detailed analysis, that in some cases, even with big players, they are at some of the companies at risk of bankruptcy, which creates a huge problem. So yeah, started with confirming that we see the problem exists. And thank you for the invitation, because the debate on this issue is very needed, I think. We are also in the very interesting point of time. We've got very interesting time in case of processes that are being launched on the European level, very difficult geopolitical situation, and so on. We've got now discussion on the Clean Industrial Deal. We are changing CBAM, like Vicente said. We are working on Omnibus. We are looking forward to some proposals that will be put forward by the Commission in the coming months on the CBAM. But it also means that we are still changing CBAM. So CBAM, which is expected by the industry, but we still don't have clarity how the system will work, how it will be implemented, will it be implemented on time by member states, and so on. So I think that the point that we are now is very interesting, and the discussion on the export issues is needed. I agree with your diagnosis on the combination of measures that may be implemented to help the industry, and I think that we need combination of measures like lowering cost of investment, creating clean markets, supply of needed inputs, and so on, alongside with the measures like rebates or your proposal on the solution for the exporters. Now the question, there is a lot of questions still, how your proposal will work, where the money will come from for all the measures that are needed. Of course, we've got Clean Industrial Deal and proposal to create industrial decarbonization bank. We are talking about using money from the ETS, but it's also a question who will lose, because if we are talking that we still keep our ambitions in the climate policy, that we will use allowances within the cap that is already set, that we will use revenues from the ETS to help industry, it means that if the industry is going to win, someone going to lose. So we need to take money from other sectors like energy, like transport, and so on. So it's a very delicate situation. We need to balance the needs of transforming different sectors in order to help industry. So another issue is that we are now talking about the ETS, meaning bigger companies. But in 2027, the ETS2 will kick in. And when it will be done, we will also burden smaller ones. But still, there will be a lot of exporters, and there will be also a problem with the ETS2. So I think that your proposal is going in the very good direction, and thank you for the report that you've prepared. But there is still a lot of questions that need to be answered in order to implement effective tool to help the industry. And also one more thing that I would add to your 4 key objectives that need to be solved by the implemented tool. It's about the timing, because you are right that we need something very quick. That's why I think that we need to also consider some kind of temporary measures that could be implemented very fast. And I'm looking onto keeping free allocation maybe to some extent until we will implement the final solution that will answer all the questions in the context of export. Yes, so maybe I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Dziękuję, Paweł. Thank you for reminding
Nie ma za co.
local issues and of course distributional concerns and so forth. All very helpful. I'll turn again in the interest of time, since we're running late, to Sam van den Plas. Sam, it's been a while. Thanks for joining us. He's policy director at Carbon Market Watch. And I remember a few years ago, Carbon Market Watch with other environmental NGOs sort of criticized or was against the export solutions for some of the reasons I mentioned earlier. And yet at the same time, I think you're very supportive of CBAM and probably concerned about anything that would destabilize political support for CBAM. So curious, have positions evolved since then? And what would be your take on this proposal or other ideas around export leakage? Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much, Michael, for the invitation. I'm happy to contribute to this debate. Indeed, we've been involved in exploring the CBAM and looking what it would mean, basically already when the European Green Deal was conceived and when the Fit for 55 package was proposed, because it's been clear to us for a long time that the challenge of industrial decarbonization in Europe deserves proper attention, especially since those sectors until a few years ago were lagging behind when you compare them to power sector decarbonization under the European emissions trading system. So in that sense, when the carbon border adjustment mechanism was proposed as an alternative to carbon leakage measures under the European emissions trading system, that is free emission allowance, but it's also state aid for indirect cost compensation, was definitely something worthwhile to explore from our perspective. And I think it is important to recognize the progress which has been made since then to enact this into legislation, to make sure that compared to producers who are importing goods in the EU, this CBAM over time will level the playing field and will provide that alternative to carbon leakage measures under the European emissions trading system. So the problem we're debating today is already a fraction of the problem we were looking at before the Fit for 55 package was presented. I mean, behind me is only a screenshot of our office. There are no lawyers there, no army, and definitely no WTO specialists. But I do think it is important, especially when we look at the position, the competitive position of industrial sectors in Europe, to disentangle the overall competitive situation they are in from what carbon pricing, and then even more specifically potential exports under the CBAM mean for their position. And it is important to have some nuance. I don't think blanket statements that we risk to kill European industry are helpful. It is important to be nuanced and to be targeted. I think this was also supported by the European Commission, because not everybody is at the same risk of carbon leakage. Not everybody imports and exports in the same way, and I think this also deserves proper nuance. In the report presented today, there are, I think, very important considerations in the third chapter, looking at the overall actions which can and should be taken to support industrial decarbonization. This is indeed about making sure that industry gets support for innovating in clean solutions, that lead markets are developed, that also clean renewable energy is available to industrial sectors. And these are all ideas which are wholeheartedly supported, including from the NGO side, to be clear. I do want to make some specific comments on the solution you proposed, basically to base those export rebates on the benchmarks which exist currently under the EU ETS, because this does deserve some nuance. While these benchmarks are designed to give free allocation at the level of the 10% best performance in the sector, what we see happening in reality is, and for example, the ERCST report, the state of the ETS from last year confirms this, that the amount of free allowances is more than the total amount of emissions taking place under the sectors coming from the sectors covered by the ETS. So more free emission allowances than their total emissions. So in a way, the calibration of the ETS benchmarks is not happening in a correct way. Why is this? Because the benchmarks are designed to also reward the most carbon intensive production routes, whether that is hot metal in the steel sector or whether that is clinker in the cement sector. It is very hard to bring cleaner solutions outside of those benchmarks to the market, and indeed we still see over allocation to those sectors specifically. So if you force me in a position where I have to choose a solution, I think what is described under the external support mechanism in the report is more the direction we would prefer, because that indeed would at the same time offer a solution, but also make sure that when public support is given to those industries and those sectors, it does come with some strings attached, and we make sure at the same time these industries are assisted to decarbonize in the long run, because clearly the current free allocation system is not properly designed to do that. I want to add one last word on the overall geopolitical context, which was mentioned, and also the need to make sure that Europe can and should play an international role and leadership here. The role of the CBAM revenues from our perspective is crucial there. It does not give a helpful signal to the rest of the world that these revenues just go back to the European budget. We think there can and there should be space there to also use this diplomatically for international climate finance to make sure that some of the most vulnerable countries who would be disproportionately affected by the European CBAM are compensated and assisted through these CBAM revenues. This can and we think should help to create a more positive atmosphere internationally around this. Thanks again for the invitation. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Sam, for thoughtful comments and also, constructive criticism on our proposal. I'd also like to mention that ERCST has issued a report on revenue use, and I think we echo your concerns. And I think it also deserves mention that Michael Grubb already suggested something like that decades before anybody talked about border carbon adjustments. I can't remember, Michael, whether it was 1989 or in the early 90s, but you've written about revenue use from border adjustments before any of us thought about this. And finally, I'd like to invite now Robert Jan Jekel. It was, I think, Yves that mentioned, or shouted out the steel industry as one of those affected. Robert works for ArcelorMittal, so one of the big players in the steel sector. And of course, we're also curious to hear from an industry perspective here. Robert.
Thanks a lot, Michael. Thanks for inviting us. And indeed, this is very, very timely. We just last week finished the European metals or steel and metals plan. So indeed, there was the plan to come up with, to basically put the timing of the exports proposal in Q2. So really good. And also to put a report also before, and even more important, as Ms. Hurtado said, the resource shuffling as well as the legislative proposal. Super good. And the context of this is also very good. Finally, we can as well make proposal and legislation which actually leads to investments in Europe, decarbonization investments in Europe, of course, but with a prioritization of competitiveness, the actual investments, but also economic security has to be added to. I want to congratulate Aaron with his, and by the way, and Marco, you too, but with your analysis on what is needed and why, for instance, it's so difficult to invest in the decarbonization of the steel, and that it takes time. People think it's just done like this, and that basically the business environment, for instance, on hydrogen, etc., electricity prices is now not there. The Affordable Energy Plan did not lead to a plan to lower electricity prices. It led to a lot of add-ons and stuff like that, not that. So it's really important to do it and to look for what do we need in the steel industry for the big puzzle to get our investments. So electricity prices, resource shuffling, CBAM, exports is a piece of the puzzle. Of course, trade policy as well. But let's now go to this issue, because all these issues will have to be there in order for us to make these investments. It has been in the press that from ourselves, all our European operations are currently still at risk for decision-making. Of course, we're a global company, and a lot depends on the policy. Now, how to get this right? It is indeed true that the carbon cost will indeed lead to that there's no business case anymore for, let's say, blast furnaces. It's coming due to that policy already. Question is, how can we make a business case for the decarbonization? And so it all fits together also with the resource shuffling. And then exports play, for the moment, a very crucial role. Why? I think ERCST has made a very good report also regarding the utilization of the actual steel production. I don't want to repeat all that, but that was really well written. If people want to look at that, look at the old report of that. And you clearly see now how you have developed your thinking, and now it's really the right time also to come to the right proposal. So maybe that's where we are now. So I think that is super important. When designing this policy, I think there are a couple of assumptions we want to have. One is we don't want decarbonization by deindustrialization. And that is not so easy because you have to make the business case ready. Then it has to be, of course, the measure has to be effective. What we hear sometimes is that there are some options to, let's say, take care of the export problem by, for instance, decarbonization or even innovation funding. If you don't do the innovation funding, you will not have or decarbonization funding, you will have not the investments in the steel industry. So we need, that's basically a supposed solution doesn't work. So we have to find solutions which do work. And they're there, you mentioned them. There can be a rebate, free location. Those work and have to be also working. The other one is also, it is important because that means that EU industry will stay under the EU cap. It will not be, so it's not only about is it cleaner or not. You are under the EU cap, otherwise you're just outside the EU cap, whether you're clean or not. That's often forgotten, I think. We respect it. We want, of course, in Europe, the industry, but I think that's an important point. WTO issues, you mentioned them all. I think if I'm going to repeat what you said, and also I think Aegis also have made some really good points there. One thing on that, there was supposedly a problem on that. We think if there's no overcompensation, there should be no problem. In general, of course, there are the colors you mentioned. We have seen many reports which say that, but we didn't have the CD report why that wouldn't be the case. What we understand is that there might be concerns that if you do that, for instance, rebate or free location, that it could be seen as supporting fossil production in the EU. So you keep your fossil production in the EU. And maybe in theory, people think that way, but if you look a bit in commercial reality, you're not going to, in our case, put a steel plant on just for your export of a tiny bit of your plant. Export, again, look at the report from ERCST, is really important also to run full of your plant, but it of course cannot justify to make your plant work at the EU and keep them running. This is let's say a fake worry, and we have to get now, luckily, to the arguments why we can keep the investments basically in Europe and decarbonize, make a business case there. I think those are really well reflected in your report. So I can only congratulate you that for you with a sense of reality. Yeah, I think those are the points I wanted to make. So thanks a lot.
Robert, thank you. Thanks also for bringing a perspective that we always try to reflect, which is the commercial reality of both investments and operations in different sectors, because that is indeed something that's often overlooked. And for instance, when we lawyers work on just the legal aspects. Of course, at the end of such a fantastic panel, we want to now open for Q&A. We still have a pretty sizable participation, almost 150 attendees in addition to the panelists. And I'm sure there will be questions, comments from the audience. The way we do it is we ask you to raise your hand. And what we then can do is unmute you or promote you to a panelist so that you can unmute yourself and share your question or comment with us and with the panel. And while the audience thinks about that, I'd also invite, of course, my co-authors, Laure and Aaron, to respond if they have any reactions, any thoughts immediately in response to the excellent inputs from our various panelists over the last 10 minutes, 20 minutes.
Michael, I will take advantage of that offer, especially since I'm going to have to leave the meeting early. It's not planned. I'm supposed to be sitting in a hotel in Ottawa right now, but travel disruption has caused me to be running away from this meeting and catching a flight in about 10 minutes. So if I could offer just a couple of quick thoughts before I do run away. One minor and one more fundamental. The minor thought is, I mean, I think I would have my Canadian citizenship revoked if I didn't point out that while it has been frequently argued that the European Union has lower GHG intensity of production than the rest of the world in covered sectors, that's not universally true. At the national average level, there are countries which produce more cleanly than the EU in some sectors, and I'm thinking steel and aluminum here, and in the context of Canada. And of course, at the level of the firm, even China, which is overall a quite dirty producer of most of these goods, has some clean producers and has enough of them, moreover, to actually swamp the EU market. So then we get into the question of resource shuffling, which could be the subject of an entire another panel. Just to point out those issues. And then more fundamentally on the WTO legal question, just some quick thoughts. As Yves Mélin said, it's okay to lose in the WTO. If the downsides of taking the kinds of risk that we've advocated for are not catastrophic or are not end of world stuff. First, I mean, note that it takes a long time to litigate these issues. If we look at the famous Boeing Airbus subsidies case in the WTO, it took 17 years to come to final resolution on that case. So they go back and forth for a while. Second, once you lose the case, if you lose the case, you can either fix it, as Eve has suggested, or you can pay. There is some precedent. The EU lost a case in WTO over the use over banning the import of hormone-treated beef, but decided that there was such a priority to its principles in that case that instead of changing that law, it would pay damages in the form of allowing trade remedies against it and maintain the law, right? Two more things on WTO. I mean, we've said that the partners care less about the multilateral trade regime than the EU, and it was pointed out that the US may be one of those partners. US is not the only one of those partners. Many other countries, the retaliations to the US tariffs, for example, were strictly not WTO legal, but they were undertaken anyway. Canada has raised its tariffs on China EVs to match the US tariffs in a completely WTO illegal manner. So while the US may be taking a leadership role in the erosion of the basis for multilateral trade system, it has plenty of followers. Not, however, among the developing countries and weak economies who depend on a rules-based system to protect them from a might is right free-for-all in international trade. So let's remember that when we talk about the sanctity of the multilateral trading system, we are thinking about a system that protects the weak, all right? And then to finish, we're not advocating a willy-nilly breaking of WTO rules. And I think we've expressed it well. We are advocating for a perhaps more courageous appetite for risk and for risk after having minimized to the extent possible the degree to which the solutions we're proposing actually trigger that risk. That's it. And by the way, I'm pronouncing on this stuff. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not trained as a lawyer. I'm an economist, but I never hesitate to get on a soapbox in any case.
Wonderful. Thank you, Aaron. And I certainly, as a lawyer, want to share what you said. And I sort of mentioned also in response, I think it was to Eve, that of course the WTO is under tremendous pressure institutionally, and the interpretations of certain doctrines have evolved over time as the world has changed. So there is also a very good chance that even more traditional understandings of certain concepts will have evolved, again, reducing the risk that was outright violating. But none of us ever proposed to sort of try and get rid of it or just ignore it like some countries unfortunately are doing. So again, to the audience, encourage you to raise your hands. For those who don't know, there is a button at the bottom, but we already have two familiar and cherished participants in many of these events. And I'll start with the first who raised his hand, who is Peter Bocek of CEFIC, the European Chemicals Association. Peter, please.
Thank you, Michael. Excellent discussion, excellent presentations. I really enjoy this session, and I would like to ask the question, isn't it a little bit chicken and egg debate when we discuss ETS and CBAM, especially the export solution that we are all looking for? The chemical industry is selling 1/3 of our sales to outside EU. So for us, it is absolutely vital. If you consider really enlarging the scope of CBAM, then you need to really think of a probable and a workable solution for exports. And the question, chicken and egg, is indeed, it's good that we look at CBAM and ETS at the same time, that we don't look at ETS as a given fixed legislation, and CBAM then has to repair the damage that might occur. So we should really look at both as one element, that like commuting vessels, that you really don't try to fix one thing and then try to see the results and solve the problem with the other. So my suggestion would be, indeed to look at problems simultaneously, not only looking at the export in general, but also looking at the value chain at the same time. If we have an imperfect export solution and then look later on at all the downstream products for the chemical industry, that would also not be a good way to approach it. So we should really find a probable and workable way in the ETS and with the CBAM exports, ideally at the same time with one impact assessment and not in a piecemeal approach. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. I'll turn right to the next. Let's collect a few inputs before inviting the panel also to respond. The next that I had on the list is Frédéric Simon, who's been a veteran journalist covering a lot of these developments in Brussels or from Brussels, I believe at least, and is now at Carbon Pulse, another stellar publication. Frédéric, please.
Thank you, Michael. I was wondering whether some of the panelists would react to the proposal that was presented today by ERCST. So I understand the Commission is preparing its options paper for publication in May to deal with the exports under CBAM. And so I'd like to know whether the panelists believe that the system that's been presented today by ERCST, whether they think this should be top of the list, or do they believe other solutions should be considered first. And so this is more maybe a question for Robert Jekel, Sam van der Plas, and maybe even Peter Boschek. Thank you.
Thank you, Frédéric. Appreciate that. We're curious, of course, as well to hear what others think, but we already got, I think, some feedback, but this is a very pointed question. Should it be top of list? I'll also invite, I saw that Nuri Essa had raised a hand, and so I'll also invite you to formulate a question or comment, if you can hear us.
Hello, everybody.
Yes, we can hear you. Speak up. It's a bit low.
Okay. Hello, everybody.
Hello, Nuri. And tell us where you are and who you represent, for those who don't know.
I am from Libya. I work for Libyan Iron Steel Company, which product DRI and HBI and steel also. So my query or my question: in our factories, we have power plant, thermal power plant. How to calculate the indirect emission for my plant to CBAM calculation?
All right. That's a very specific, a good technical question. I think we can venture an answer, even though it's not really what we are discussing today, but it's probably quickly answered, which I will be happy to do. But of course, I think, Robert, as a fellow steelmaker, maybe you also want to dispel concerns by Nuri regarding Annex 1 and Annex 2 and indirect emissions for steel manufacturing. But anyway, we have 3 inputs from Peter, Frédéric, and Nuri. And I'll just open to our panelists, anyone who wants to respond to any of these 3. And meanwhile, of course, still encouraging our audience to continue collecting thoughts and questions and raising your hand so we can put you in the pipeline. Sam, I see that you have raised your hand. Please go ahead.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks a lot for the questions. Maybe to reply to Frédéric's question, and I've given some indications when I spoke first, but I think it's important to recognize what we are looking at in the CBAM is a very gradual implementation when it comes to the carbon costs impacts on the sectors which are covered. It will take until 2034 before the free emission allowances are fully replaced, and the majority of them remains intact before 2030. So I mean that phase out timeline was a big part of the discussions during the legislative process, and I think it's fair to say we've landed on something which is very gradual, which is maybe even a bit too timid, but it is there. I think in this context, regulatory stability is also an important element, and predictability for business and industry, I hope, is something which can be shared across the board. From our perspective, as much as the free emission allowances go down, this is an implementation of the polluter pays principle, and at the same time, it also does generate those auctioning revenues, which can and should also be invested in industrial decarbonization. So and I hear those voices saying downstream products, resource shuffling, indirect emissions, all very important considerations, and they all merit a deeply technical discussion on their own. But to summarize, I would say it is important not to make the perfect the enemy of the good here. And again, regulatory stability, I believe, is also something very important. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. Any other reactions from the panel?
Shall I? So if you have regulatory stability, certainty, which is negative, of course, that's then you will have a negative decision. So we prefer to have a regulatory certainty which is positive for your investment case. I think that's the most important. Also of the new European policy, that we all try to do that. I think that's super important. Now, coming back to Frederik's question, just to be honest, we're still assessing if that can lead to an effective, because that's the main thing, an effective, or you could call it avoidance of carbon leakage. But if it is basically a reflection of a rebate or free allocation for exports, then we could maybe support it. We're still assessing. So if that is indeed an effective tool, but could be.
Thanks, Robert. You did not address the question from our DRI producer in Libya, but
no,
maybe
I'll leave that to you. I'm not gonna advise other
no problem.
steel producers.
I'll do it quickly. So, just to put that concern aside for now, at least you don't have to worry about your indirect emissions from 2026 onwards. You neither will have to report nor comply for them, even though your captive power plant's electricity generation does count as indirect emissions, but it's not one that you have. And that's where you have to look at Annex 1 and Annex 2 of the CBAM regulation. Okay, this was an exception. Normally, we don't try to give kind of any advice. And again, disclaimer, this is not legal advice of any sort. It's really just indicative to get proper counsel. I did see another question from the audience and another regular, Tomasz Wostowski, who's been an advisor working from Poland and Brussels with a number of companies. Tomasz, please.
Yes. Hi, everyone. Nice to see you all again. Listen, I have a sort of maybe a provocative observation or a question to the panel, and I'm really sort of interested in your take on this. So look, I think it's fair to say that ETS, we've had it for, over 20 years. It's been quite successful in decarbonizing the European energy systems. And I think it's fair to say it's failed in decarbonizing the industry. It's just because the industry has sort of very specific issues. So with ETS, we have not succeeded decarbonizing the industry. That's why we have these efforts in bringing green hydrogen and all the other sort of things, industry-specific things to help specific industries. We've devised CBAM to counter the problems with ETS. This was 21. Now we're facing a war for 3 years. We're facing massive geopolitical shifts that we haven't even dreamed of, the stuff that's happening, a few months ago. The things that are happening today, we have the United States, trying to take a part of Europe, basically. So my question is this, and sorry for the provocative context of it, but I mean, is finding the perfect WTO compatible, technically pure solution for export competitiveness, is that really the top issue for Brussels and for DG Klima, for DG Trade? I'm listening to this discussion, and I heard Vincenta. I'm sad he's gone, but I just find the idea that the Commission today is really focusing a lot of resources, a lot of people on finding the perfect solution for export competitiveness. I just think it's a ridiculous proposition, quite frankly. We should be focusing on competitiveness. We should find some measure to help European industry, because we need industry to face the global challenges we're facing. Right? So my question, I guess, to the panel is, should we not just really completely shift gears and very simplify this discussion about export competitiveness Stop looking for the perfect solution. Find any solution as quickly as possible and focus on the really big challenges that Brussels and Europe is facing. Thank you.
Move decisively now, apologize later, sort of, I think, was the gist of it. Any thoughts from the panel? I mean, we already kind of touched upon this now. How important is the legality?
I think I can start, but I really sympathize with Thomas, with your probably what you behind your question. But unfortunately, I think I mentioned it already. We need now to get the right investment decisions for Europe, and we need to have this competitiveness. Finding an export, the problems of otherwise will stay of this export issue, and other issues will also stay. We need to find a solution to it all, and this is a puzzle piece which belongs in this picture for competitiveness, whether you like it or not. This is what it is, and we have to find it. And we are supportive of the CBAM. We are supportive of also to find effective solutions there. We're not going to drag back. We just want good policy, not later policy or something like that. Effective. That's the main word. And then on that we need to make the investment decisions, and that is the main competitiveness for Europe. If you have seen something else, but then you have to propose how you do it differently, because that is then the challenge. And for the moment, this is what it is.
Thank you, Robert. Well, Thomas, you did what I was hoping for. You sparked several reactions. So I have Michael, then Sam, and then Yves. Let's start with Michael.
Okay. I suppose I hinted at this in my remarks, but I think it crystallizes my reaction to that last intervention, which is historically to date, I think the European Commission has paid huge attention to WTO compatibility and not nearly enough to geopolitical feasibility, acceptability, buy-in, strategic implications with partners. I could argue we are now entering a world where the opposite is true, but they might also be well aligned. It may well be that, actually being seen to make efforts that do respect international law is one of the keys to geopolitical acceptability. And if you don't have that, some of the things Europe tries to do may turn out to be very unstable for investors or to invite retaliatory action, which would also not help industry. So I don't actually think the substantive issue changes massively, even if the motivations do. But you need to think about international acceptability. Legitimacy, perhaps, is even a better word for what Europe does in this area.
Thanks, Michael. Great point. I think Sam was next, and then Yves. Sam, please.
Yeah, I wanted to add to that, and also to say we don't think that the ETS working hand in hand with CBAM is the silver bullet here, nor should it be. There are lots of challenges to tackle in parallel, and making sure that the industry consumes energy in an efficient way, that renewable energy sources are available to them, that we implement objectives of the circular economy. That all will not be deployed at scale necessarily by the ETS and CBAM alone. In terms of the existential challenges, please allow me to remind you of the climate crisis. There is a big one out there which will also not go away if we don't do anything. European emissions trading system there in the European context is definitely a cornerstone, but it will have to work hand in hand with ensuring that the consumption of fossil fuels in industrial sectors, whether that's coal in the steel sector or other fossil fuels in the chemical sector, that has to be phased out over time. So that's also clearly a challenge which should go hand in hand with what we have been discussing here today so far.
Yes, thanks for that. Also important reminder, physics does trump politics in the end too. And finally to Yves.
Yes, what I wanted to say is that in terms of simplicity and efficacy of the system and the export rebate that you're calling for, what is really important is that there should be a complete refund of the carbon cost for European industries so that they can compete on foreign markets on an equal footing, and then pay over there whatever carbon cost the governments are imposing. And so I haven't had the time either to review in detail all the nitty-gritty of your suggestion, but having making sure that the carbon cost is to be paid in the country of consumption is a really healthy compass. The EU is decarbonizing whatever is consumed in Europe. It's 20% of world consumption. It's significant. And then European producers are going to sell in third country market, and third country markets are going to incentivize decarbonization at their own rhythm. And that's a healthy system until we reach a point where there is international agreement of having something a bit more streamlined, which we don't have right now. And the CBAM, I remember that too, was introduced when one of the COP failed, I think the one in Madrid, where international agreement proved impossible and the EU decided to move alone. And so a system where you have a carbon burden where goods are consumed, and then for European producers, you refund the burden, and so that it has a carbon burden wherever it's consumed outside of the EU, is a good system. So the adjustment should provide for a full refund of the carbon burden in the EU is what I think is important. And it's essential for the efficacy of the whole system, ETS, CBAM, and export rebate to function, in my opinion.
Thank you, Yves, and reminding us of the destination principle, which has indeed been mentioned in a number of these papers as an important underlying rationale. Peter, I see that you also offer an input, which you're very welcome to do.
Yes, thank you, Michael. And I would support very much what Yves said. And I would like to remind that indeed just basing a refund on the ETS benchmark, of course, falls short of all the downstream goods that are not under ETS, but that carry a carbon cost. So indeed, there we need to think it together and treat it together to avoid loss of markets. And I would even supplement what Robert said. It's not only about investment, it's also about maintaining industry as it exists with existing assets in Europe. It's not only about new investment that we have to think about here. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. While I see if there's any final questions from the audience, I'll take the liberty as a moderator to also weigh in on Thomas's question. And I think, again, being here in just outside DC, I mean, we all are, as I mentioned earlier, looking to what April will bring with this announced reciprocal trade policy that Donald Trump has repeatedly already hinted at, which, if implemented, as some discussions suggest, or some of the early sort of glimpses of what it might mean, of course, there's tremendous uncertainty still, essentially upends the international trading order. It does away with the most favored nation principle, which is one of the two sort of foundational principles of WTO law. And so the question is, when the largest economy in the world more or less completely gets out of or ignores that decade-old system, how do others respond? How do others react? And it's not just WTO. I mean, do we need to find a perfect WTO compatible solution? Even that wouldn't be enough. Don't forget that the Department of Commerce of the United States a couple of years ago determined during the Biden administration that free allocation under the EU ETS was a countervailable subsidy. They had initiated CVD investigations. So, and this was not a WTO, this was a national unilateral thing. So whether or not it's WTO compatible, you might still have countries that are using it for economic policy and geopolitical ends, challenge it. So the risk is always there. I think we have to keep that in mind. I do see that Robert has raised his hand, and this might be the last reaction we have from the panel. But of course, if there are any others.
It's actually a question.
Please go ahead.
But only a very dedicated question, maybe a good one also for concluding. For Pavel, the Polish government, the Polish presidency. So you see all the activities coming up from the Commission now, big changes also from the metals plan now, steel metals plan on this issue, and now the other carbon issues. You saw the very good, I would say, discussion with the major countries, France, Italy, etc., Poland itself as well. What is Poland, the presidency, going to do on this, and how is the council basically going to develop itself on that? So thanks.
Pavel, inviting you if you want to respond. I'm just looking. Yeah.
No pressure, otherwise.
No, I think. Go ahead. I'm looking. I think we actually lost him. He may have had to drop out.
Okay. That is maybe, yeah.
Regrettable. Well, those are the tribulations when you're in the presidency. You might have sudden, calls and challenges, even though we're not quite at the official ending time. No, I think, we've had a great discussion. I really want to thank all the panelists. Also, of course, Vicente, who's no longer with us, but maybe he'll look at the recording to hear what subsequent comments came from both panelists and audience, to thank for joining in a busy time. It's clearly a time of change and uncertainty and disruptions, and the EU is responding its own or it's adjusting its own behaviors and reactions to the evolving broader context. And we know that by May, we will have a communication that gives us a sense of next steps. But we also know that's not the end of the road, and ERCST will surely continue accompanying this topic. Just a reminder for all those who follow the work of ERCST, there will be now a process to think about expansion of the scope of the CBAM, which is, of course, another very important issue. So we'll have consultations with stakeholders and experts before then launching a report in June in a similar format as today, again with excellent panelists. With that, I think we can call this discussion, which has been long but very fruitful and certainly for me greatly rewarding. Once again, thanking our panelists and also our audience for having stayed with us throughout this. Have a good rest of the day, everybody, and see you next time. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Bye.